Hi, my name is Andrew Cody Williams, and this is Excerpt Etudes, a collaboration between myself and Professor Jeff Braditich to not only show the different ways to tackle tricky passages in orchestral excerpts, but to do it in a way that makes it fun for students, young and professional alike. Before I get into all the details for how this all works, I would like to show you a finished product with a duet setting performing our introductory etude, the Scherzo to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Grab some paper and a pencil, and enjoy. Hello again. I'm glad you chose to take part in experiencing Excerpt Etudes. That was me and a friend of mine, Ian Grems, taking a quick recording. As you heard in the scherzo, there are quite a few different ways to look at trouble spots in our repertoire. Just in the Scherzo, Trio, Mozart Symphony 40, and Brahms Symphony 2 today, you will hear dozens of ways to isolate sections and utilize practice methods to help you get better control of the excerpts you've heard and played thousands of times. The aim of these excerpts is to help people understand the underlying problems of what they're playing, as well as know what they can do to improve other than practice through repetition. Each excerpt can be performed with up to 4 bass parts, and is available to be played in recitals, lectures, excerpt classes, and lessons. My dream when first setting out was to create a practice method that was performable, and to involve the context of the greater orchestra to make these etudes as strong a learning tool as they could be. Thus, the Scherzo was written, and the collection began with a few simple ideas. Before we get into the action, I still have a little more explaining to do on the process and unique features that makes Excerpt Etudes a thing of its own. As mentioned before, it's all about isolating trouble spots and specific techniques of the excerpts themselves before acting on a solution. Why would you try to fix something you don't understand anyway? That is why it's very important to know what we are talking about before acting. The problems from the original excerpts will be displayed as well as the written way to improve the issue, which is the root of the project to begin with. You will find that there are sections that have less to do with technical problems, but that is only because we want to make something musical and enjoyable. Who wants to open up a technique book and practice in a cramped practice room? These etudes are built to be shared, and should be for maximum gains. This leads us to the accompaniment. Needless to say, the etude is confined to the first bass part. A simple accompaniment was added in bass 2, which will be most effective in lessons when an almost sight-readable part is ready to show better context of the piece outside of the bass part. Parts 3 and 4 rest in a category I call layered accompaniment. Oh no! I want to play this quartet, but there are only 3 bass players in this state. Well, that is not a problem. Layered accompaniment is designed for this issue, so now you can perform as a duet, trio, or quartet based on your means. This can be seen now through an excerpt from the etude Mozart Symphony 40. Parts 1 and 2 are essential, but if needed, we could play without bass 4 and even bass 3. It just so happens that this type of writing helped me in setting this presentation to a PowerPoint video, as social distancing and public safety prevented gatherings from occurring. It wasn't just to stop 4 basses from getting together either. Take a moment to study the writing and see how the organization works. Here are a few more examples. As you can see, parts 1 and 2 are essential together. Part 3, though, can afford to be lost, even though it enhances the performance. This is more so for part 4, which acts almost as an auxiliary for much of the etudes listed. You've heard the Scherzo so far, which is the one I wrote a year before the others. The big difference between these is the concept versus potential. After writing the Scherzo, I imagined what could be accomplished by expanding this project in direct contact with Jeff Braditich. The difference is remarkable in terms of detail, solutions, and connection with the other instruments. So you will find that the presentation of the Scherzo is shorter than the others and covers a more general range of technique for improvement. But keep a close eye out for references to other pieces, as they love to hide in each etude. I want you to think about your favorite etude book. What about it really helped you become a better bassist? Are there ideas in this presentation that you or a student could benefit from? Please keep all of this in mind as we finally get to the facts. One final note before we begin. These etudes are still being edited even after the release of this presentation. In the visual examples, there are sure to be bowings or even an occasional note that is different in the recordings. Just know that this should not draw away from the presentation as a whole. This is being put together during quarantine, after all, as the original medium for demonstration was going to be a lecture recital, which is now canceled. So let's begin with the Scherzo. So in the Scherzo, there are a few common techniques that reveal themselves over the course of the excerpt. These problems are string crossing, and extreme at that, reaching across all 4 strings from beginning to end. Quick shifting, that can be found at the ends of these early string crossings and even more common as we progress. And another big one is dynamic control. Now the last one may not seem too apparent, but we need to keep in mind that we are playing this as a section and with cellos as well. So it's important to be aware of the type of sound we're putting out in order to blend with an orchestra. Also, throughout all of these etudes we'll be going by rehearsal letters. While the Scherzo is straightforward and marked like a rehearsal, each letter actually makes a new practice method. This normally wouldn't need to be brought up, but keep in mind that this is how the etudes are organized, and repeated methods for the sake of a continuous music will arise in later etudes. This means things like A2 may come after B. All it is an alteration to the forward progress, but we'll see that later. Right now, all is in order. Starting our focus on string crossing, notice how the passage moves across all 4 strings. It can be all too easy to demonstrate a lack of bow control from the very beginning of our excerpt. To counter this, we begin by adding a note until the first 5 notes are connected. There are different ideas about starting down or up as well, so to help, we will learn both, as will be required once the 5 notes have been added. It never hurts to be prepared. The next troubling part we are going to look at is the shifts that arrive while we are still thinking about string crossings. While it can be a bad habit to play one right after the other, we bring light to the issue. One needs to be ready for the change and make sure their left hand reaches the notes before the right begins playing. As you can see from the original excerpt in the top two examples, a resonant sound with lots of bow is required even if it's not directly asked for. Given that we will be battling with horns and joining the rest of the orchestra, we need to make ourselves heard. This is accomplished through a little manipulation in the etude. On the bottom left, you can see a double up after our down bow. If you were not using a lot of bow before, you will be after playing what's written. The same goes for the bottom right in creating a broad, connecting sound through the moving line, even if we force space between them. Often in music, it can be easy to ignore a sforzando or do it incorrectly. The etude takes this opportunity to try out a few sforzandos, then try without to see what difference they make. About halfway through the etude, we do a review of everything we have covered before moving on to new material. Take a moment to notice the string crossings, shifting, and bow control required in the example. One major aspect of the scherzo is expressing the 3-1 motion of the lines. The top two examples show the music as written. As you can see, counting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1 might be the last thing on your mind. The etude takes this problem and isolates it, requiring the performer to focus on the horizontal demands of the music instead of the vertical. Any of us who have taught this excerpt in a lesson or group class know how disastrous the listed example can be for tempo. Half of the basses are dragging and half are rushing, but no one is where they should be. Focusing on the quarter notes and altering slurs to practice their togetherness may not be the first way to improve on a passage such as this, but the fact is that the etude truly does cause focus on the tempo when we vary the passage as shown. Due to Beethoven's frequent use of syncopation, it felt appropriate to add an example to the etude as well. While this does not relate specifically to the excerpt, it is a technique that should not be ignored. One final challenge added to the Scherzo etude is making sure that we keep the tempo even while not playing. While this is more of a focus in the etude for the trio, it is something we should be aware of in the extended rests of the Scherzo. Before moving on to the trio, we'll take a last look at what we have covered. If you would like to hear the piece in its entirety, feel free to go back to the beginning of the presentation. The trio to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is the first in our remaining etudes to focus on more specific techniques rather than generalized. Rhythm might not be the first thing to come to one's mind when the movement is mentioned, but the bow control to keep the notes even requires this simple practice variation to create the foundation of our etude. Similar to the scherzo, we will also be manipulating bowings to replicate wanted effects as well. One of the deeper layers to the excerpt requires a wide range of dynamic control, which will be explored. The etude has a reoccurring section, so don't forget that this represents one of the exercises and has nothing to do with rehearsal. Don't be surprised when we reach A4. Like I suggested before, rhythmic practice is one of a few really good ways to even out some notes. This can be found throughout the etude offering 2 different rhythms. However, the performer should be aware of other rhythmic possibilities beyond these. Over the course of this excerpt, the timing of the rest can be overlooked and cause musicians to come in early. One way to gain some awareness of this is to physically feel the downbeat of the measure by playing it. Doing so takes the guesswork out of performance and helps to keep the feeling even after we move on to actually following the rest. A common issue in the trio is starting in tune on the octave Gs. The etude has a section written to allow the performer to adjust and listen to the pitch before following what is originally written. In addition, we ask for a re-articulation of the downbeat similar to letter B to help keep the tempo. In the excerpt selected for this presentation, there are a variety of bow strokes to study and understand. On a basic level, Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms are the biggest three composers that require different types of control, especially when it comes to spiccato. The next etudes all have sections that push the shorter and long bowings, and search for the boundaries of these composers' music. While on the topic of bow strokes, the trio typically follows two different styles for both quarter notes and eighths. By simplifying this transition to playing the same note, the performer can make sure to focus on the demands of the right hand. Just like placing the downbeat from before, we are faced with another exercise taking a step further, playing a moving line in between. It's not the biggest of differences, but the gradual advance is helpful in adding the left hand. We have all had a moment in practice where we blow through a line and find our fingers twisted and confused. The add a note practice method is utilized in this etude briefly to demonstrate a way to go about piecing a passage together. Sustaining the correct length of half notes is important on auditions as well as actual performance. Letter H is another example of progression in the etude, internalization of the beat leading to learned timing. What separates new musicians in this excerpt from experienced performers is the ability to allow one's dynamic level to drop to nearly nothing. Some simple dynamic practice is asked for before investigating other methods in this diminuendo. No study of Beethoven would be complete without the use of sforzandos and syncopation. The performer is allowed some time over these techniques to contextualize playing with Beethoven's style. One way I like to practice is by exaggerating the boundaries of music. This allows me to find what I'm looking for and allows me to better place myself in what I believe is the correct range that is asked for. In this example, we will work on a diminuendo so exaggerated that it dies away before we can even play the last note. We will never be asked to get softer on this section again. For one more exercise in keeping the tempo, the performers will actually be asked to sing pa on beats 2 and 3, rather than simply counting the rests. This maintains the light, in-tempo feeling into the last measures of the etude. It's a bit of a drawback if you can't sing, but no worries. That's why you chose bass. Let's hear all of these methods together in our duet performance of the trio. Now that we moved on from Beethoven, let's look at a few more composer-specific issues. Mozart Symphony 40 is a great excerpt to study for its bowing demands, uncommon fingering options, and the bar line extending phrases that define the piece. Without further explanation, let's get to it. Rhythms, as always, are necessary when practicing extended passages. This, along with subjects that span multiple symphonies, are important to bring up from the beginning of our etude. We will be experimenting with many different inflections and points of emphasis throughout the etude, the first being a focus on evenness outside of our rhythm changes. By performing extended slurs, we make sure that the left hand acts as it should by holding notes the correct length before we begin to examine the right hand's accountability. Rather than rushing through and believing we'll stop ourselves to practice note transitions, the etude is written to give the performer a little extra time to think and prepare. After the opportunity to practice a simple method is finished, we move on to a closer version of the piece. Notice how the bottom measures of the slide fall in line with the original excerpt on top. While keeping the left hand even is an important step early on in attaining our bowings for the excerpt, the right hand must not be forgotten. We begin this multi-step process by making sure that separate bows are even. This makes us aware of the length of notes when we begin slurring it all together. The subtlety in Mozart as well as much of the music of this time is not always natural to the 21st century musician. Because of this, the etude requires more of our notated manipulation to help understand the effect. The etude fragment at the bottom of the slide shows the lift or release needed to keep the bowing straight, but it does much more as well. Notice the unwritten musicality of the two parts in the original excerpt on top. The principle applies to all three examples in varying degrees and so must be communicated in performance. Ignoring the large phrase of the example given, there are repetitive subphrases just crossing each bar line. Following the eighth note downbeat, we have 7 notes leading to the next downbeat, and again after that. This is another subtle detail in the music that requires control of up bows by the performer. This can be exercised on both notes 2 and 4 of each 4-note segment. As mentioned before, bowstroke experimentation is important in each of these excerpts to find both the boundaries and the sweet spots. Just as an added challenge, we will also add dynamics to the Mozart etude to take things a step further. Just wait until we get to the one in the Brahms. Similar to the past exercise marking subphrases, we will again be looking into the way Mozart has his music lead. The etude works on the lift and release effects on pickup notes, which can be applied on a faster scale to the excerpt segment shown. The 4th note leads like a pickup to the 5th, and the 8th leads to the downbeat. This technique applies a little more to French bow players rather than German, but the exercise helps either way. The act of string crossing often leads to a need to give more. And to clear the strings on an instrument that in many cases is bigger than the player, we really have to make a commitment. By isolating the act of the string crossing, we can increase its efficiency, and as a result, gain better clarity. Much of this etude focuses on evening notes. However, we must also adjust emphasis and balance for what we'll call afterthought notes. Before trying with the slurs, we will play the notes separately. Next, the performer will be given time to prepare between the notes. Rather than getting overwhelmed with lots of shifts in a row, the performer will be required to take steps in adding notes until the original passage has been reached. Now we move on to the next step in playing even slurs. Rather than doing separate bows, we are required to play an on-the-string double up to represent portato, emphasizing the different notes but not yet placing them together as a single idea. One of the great things about these etudes is the fact that the accompaniment is written to help the performer understand the context of the piece. The ways to look at an excerpt by itself versus with all instruments as it was written creates two entirely different interpretations, which must be helped if one is to play it as intended. Just before the test section of this etude, the student will play the melody to understand how the bass fits in overall. While the etudes avoid direct quotation of the original excerpt in favor of specific studies, this excerpt is exceptional in the way that so much is going on throughout the orchestra. Because of this, the entire excerpt is placed later in the etude so that the performer may hear the many parts written around them. Towards the end of the etude, we have another reminder to practice rhythms. There are so many straight eighths to play that consistency is essential in performance of this excerpt. A common issue in musicians is to focus on the beginnings of runs, but to look past the ends to prepare for another beginning. To bring attention to this, the etude asks for focus on the downward direction, avoiding the rush to the top. There are several complex phrases in this excerpt that require leading and coming away to better show its musical direction. While we do not have notation to communicate this beyond arrows, crescendos are helpful to demonstrate the energy required to go beyond just playing the notes. With that, let's hear Mozart Symphony 40 from Excerpt Etudes. What are we going to do? Just splice the next part in? Our final etude will be discussing the fourth movement of Brahms Symphony 2. In this, our focus will be on techniques that have not yet been covered, like the release on the ends of notes, string crossings on a smaller repetitive scale, and bowing options for this excerpt's notorious soft multi-measure slurs. So far we have studied transitions between quarter notes and eighth notes, but not yet slurred quarters to separate. The first separate after a slur is always the toughest to gain control of, and so the etude introduces this study as we begin our investigation. Just because the bow has stopped pulling the string does not mean that the sound from the instrument has ended. Release is the part of the sound most often overlooked and therefore brought out early in this etude. Following this, we will be bringing back the physical placement of rests to help proper length of the notes. One could be thrown off by the sudden forte that appears after playing softly for so long. Even with getting closer to the frog, utilizing weight, and pulling the bow faster, a scratch or squeaking sound may occur. Especially if one were to play an A on the D string, they would need to remember the potential of getting closer to the bridge. While we are focused on getting closer to the bridge, a challenge comes next to require the performer to adjust between the two placements while maintaining intonation. Rather than jerking the bow arm between the strings, it is important to focus on gradual, smooth movement in performance. To work on this, double stops are written to stay calm and take time. Sometimes details are glossed over, including the sustain and release of this section of the excerpt. This motion has been taken and brought out to practice so that we may be more prepared at this point in the music. We are back to a variation on smooth string crossing, this time including a more shift-oriented approach. While included as a side note early in the etude, physical dictation of the beat and rests is examined in letter H. This is combined with the more true notation to help bridge the beat to becoming internal. The same idea of internalization is displayed in letter I in the following slide. As mentioned before, the ends of phrases are often ignored in preference to begin the next set more effectively. The same applies to Brahms, and the tricky shift in the excerpt's own letter L. Isolation of this movement helps us to practice the shift without getting too distracted with what comes before. Remember the bow stroke challenge that I said was coming up? This time we have a more tricky variation to help with overall control. The bowing has been flipped and the dynamics act suddenly for the performer to share their own focus between multiple points at once. A downward and upward lead need to be communicated without going overboard on dynamics. Notice how the first D leads down to the A and back up again. Our end goal is to create music, and these details are how we reach that point. Let's listen to the Brahms now, and keep in mind how the etude works on different ideas from the first three we heard. Let's review the ultimate goal for Excerpt Etudes. This presentation has been created to demonstrate what this etude book has to offer, and to introduce the possibilities when studying orchestral excerpts in quite a different way. The book itself, when finished, will include the first part etude as well as the 3 layered accompaniment parts that can create a duo, trio, or quartet performance. The original excerpts will also be included with recommended bowings and fingerings. Each etude will include descriptions very similar to what you have witnessed in this presentation, explaining the reasoning behind each rehearsal letter and what to focus on while practicing. The size of the project has yet to be decided, but optimistically, a collection of around 10 etudes should well cover many of the techniques we use every day in orchestral excerpts and beyond. Even though it is meant as a study, the possibilities in performance are open and a great project for many of different abilities who play the bass. Of the future etudes to be written, there are many techniques to choose from among standard orchestral excerpts, from the shifting string crossings and fingering options of Einheldenleben to the pivoting challenges in Mendelssohn. There's still more for excerpt etudes to explore. Well, there you have it. I hope you learned as much as I did over the past hour. Keep an eye out for future publications so that you and your students may have some fun new ways to study your favorite excerpts. I'm Andrew Cody Williams, and this was Excerpt Etudes.